always interested whenever I'm talking to people who are enthusiasts of Bitcoin to hear the responses to what to me are not just the most common, but compelling critiques. And I just want to ask about two in particular. One that comes from, I would say that comes from the left, that's part of the left wing resistance to it, which is that in reality, it's really just kind of a replica of a new form of oligarchy. There were these small numbers of early investors. Like now there's, as you were saying, hundreds of millions, but I don't know what the percentages are. I've seen like 90% of Bitcoin wealth in the hands of like, a tiny number of people. And therefore driving up the price of Bitcoin by talking it up has at least one primary effect, is to create an entire new oligarchy of people who are these early investors who are invested in it very early, who have large quantities of it with just a small number of people, and that Bitcoin will just reinforce the inequality it claims it's attempting to combat. And then I think on the other side, a more pragmatic concern, one I share, which is what is the reason that centers of power, which excel in nothing more than preserving their own power, will be incapable of dismantling this technology as a threat, either because it's becoming more and more centralized. People use things like Coinbase, which doesn't really provide a lot of anonymity, which gives the government kind of a clean target to go after, or breaking it down technologically the way that was done with encryption, or at the end of the day, if none of that works, just brute force, outlawing it, making it a crime to use Bitcoin. What gives you the comfort or the confidence that it won't be destroyed using some combination of those tactics?
So on the the new boss, same as the old boss aspect of the oligarchy. So first is the US dollar and Bitcoin holdings, those people, those are almost, I shouldn't say disjoint sets, but they're very different groups. The kind of person who's an early investor in Bitcoin is typically not somebody who's very powerful in the existing US establishment. They're people who are alienated from the system in some way. They believe that the Fed has, been bailing things out and so on and so forth. So at a minimum, just from a math standpoint, when you actually have two hierarchies, you've actually reduced inequality because you've made a bunch of new people rich and you've actually made a bunch of the existing people less rich. So just right there, I could show that mathematically or whatever, but essentially Bitcoin is a gigantic redistribution of wealth. Yes, to a new group of people, but because it's a new group of people, you've actually globally reduced inequality.
But not necessarily more equitably. Like it's a redistribution, and it would kind of be like you take away the billions of dollars that billionaires have, and instead of distributing it to everyone, you just give it to a new group of 1,000 people, and now you've created a new group of 1,000 billionaires. And I understand your point.
Sure.
It's better to have two groups of 1,000 millionaires than just one, but still, that's the critique.
I understand. So the V1 is basically just that even today, it actually has reduced inequality in that there's a whole new class of people who are millionaires or thousandaires or whatever, right? That's kind of the first point. The second point is the longer term effect of it actually helps everybody, including the poor, because it checks inflation. And inflation is a much worse thing. See, for moderately wealthy people and above, they can keep the vast majority of their assets in equities, which can keep up with the pace of inflation. But for the poor, their savings are destroyed. What meager savings they have are destroyed by inflation. They won't always get wage increases that keep up with their cost increases. And so, essentially, Bitcoin moving us into a system where there's just significantly less systematic inflation allows even poor people to build up. And so that, I think, is a fundamental difference versus the old system. Those are at least 2 points I'd make. The third I'd make, which Peter won't agree with, but I agree with, is that if you expand it from BTC to Web3, now you actually have an enormous number of new mechanisms for wealth creation that I do think are going to break the piñata of Facebook and so on. And rather than it being $2 trillion is just held by the shareholders of FB, it'll be like $10 trillion held by all of these decentralized, Facebooks around the world. And I think we're already seeing that. Okay. So those are kind of three arguments, but just to recap, A, it actually has reduced inequality so far because these holders are different than the old ones. B, it cuts inflation dramatically, which allows people to save. And C is it allows folks in India or Brazil or Eastern Europe or Japan or something to build protocols that compete with American tech companies, American entities, American media companies, and thereby decentralize wealth that way. So that's my answer on that. On the second one, on the centers of power, this is a good question. The short answer is, in my view, that the Chinese state is dangerously competent and the American state is dangerously incompetent. And what I mean by that is, I do think the Chinese, I think the future is Chinese control, American anarchy, and an international intermediate. That is to say, like today in the US, we're in this weird era of like anarcho-tyranny where, in San Francisco, a working class guy will get a $200 ticket for having, his car parked on the wrong side of the road or for, like a minute over. But the guy who smashes his window or poops in the street, nothing happens to him, right? So the working class guy, the blue collar guy, is basically terrorized. And the super rich person can kind of insulate themselves from all of this. But so you have this anarchy combined with tyranny, where the working class person is tyrannized, the middle class person is tyrannized, but there's like anarchy on the streets. I think though that is actually a transitional phase, and it's going to like just melt down because there's so many different things where the U.S. government is taking huge L's both domestically and around the world. It's not just the loss in Afghanistan. It's not just China telling the U.S. point blank that it doesn't have power anymore at this recent like Alaska conference with Blinken and the Chinese. It's not just like Russia trying its stuff in Crimea. It's not just El Salvador flipping off the IMF. It's not just 17 states domestically suing over education. It's not just Texas doing this abortion bill and then California responding with its own thing. It's not just cities going Bitcoin. It's not just Wyoming doing its DAO law. It is basically massive resistance both inside and outside the United States, where like on the order of 50% of the population just doesn't listen to the federal government anymore. And that's both left and right deviation. Then abroad, lots of states just don't listen either. Like, during the Obama administration, they were still like, they controlled the state enough that they could go and get Switzerland to, like open up all their bank accounts and so on. More recently, under this admin, they tried to sanction Germany over Nord Stream 2. They tried to sanction India. Both in Germany and India were trading with Russia, and they weren't able to make it stick. Right? Germany's basically stuck firm and said, F you, the US, we really need this energy pipeline. And so the US like vacillated and then eventually let the pipeline happen. And then did these sort of petulant sanctions on Germany anyway that didn't matter, but let the pipeline go through. And the same thing with India, right? So the federal government of the US is weak and getting weaker, and it's taking all kinds of L's because basically the way I think about it is it's founding versus inheriting. All these folks who are rising, to power or whatever now, they're just actors. They don't actually have skills. Like Pete Buttigieg, this transportation secretary, is taking a 4-month vacation in the middle of this gigantic supply chain crisis. Okay, that's because he's an actor. Like the actual, logistics CEO, somebody like, Brian Peterson, CEO of Flexport, who actually gets in, debugs, figures out, what's going on in the ports, right? So we have this whole thing where these people are literally selected for being actors on social media. And then we wonder why they aren't like amazing generals and, like these really, really great at construction and so on. They're literally actors, Reagan and Trump and so on, Al Franken. We see that, but we don't fully see how systemic that is, right? It's all a facade. It's all a Potemkin village. The American government is a Potemkin village. We also saw that with the US military during COVID, where for decades they had all of this bioterrorism, budget allocated billions and billions of dollars. They said they had fast vaccines, all this stuff, and they were completely MIA. So this entire part of the government that had been funded to the tune of billions, that had justified itself in terms of defending the homeland versus WMDs, of which bioterrorism was one of them, was completely MIA, totally missing in action. And so once you realize this, you realize huge parts of the US government are now just Potemkin villages, which is different than what we grew up with because, you see movies that say, oh, the US military can protect us from aliens and so on, or even movies like Contagion, right? You know that movie, right? From 2010?
Yeah, we talked about that before, yeah.
Yeah. So it portrays the CDC as like these competent, smart bureaucrats fighting this power. Like it essentially, though you don't realize it, it is Santa Claus for adults. That doesn't exist. There is no competent U.S. government. They're all idiots. Like the federal government, they're really stupid. The people you see on Twitter are the actual people. I mean, they're the actor versions, but that's a level of cognition. And so they've just basically been put into a tank where they don't even understand how to push the buttons. And that's why you see like Navy ships colliding. That's why you see overruns on the F-35 and the Zumwalt and all of these like military installations, just like in the civilian things where the subways cost hundreds of millions of dollars, the bus lanes cost hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's basically like the third or fifth generation kid who inherits a factory that he could never build. He can push a button and the widgets come out, but one day when he needs to switch it from widgets to masks or to guns, he's completely in over his skis because he can't make a change. And that's the fundamental thing. This establishment cannot handle the change of the internet. So what they're trying to do is jam it back into the box, right? Push it back into the garage, use what powers they have, right? But even there, they're too ADD to like truly do that. And they kind of lost a lot of energy after 2021 and they didn't push it all the way. Now the backlash has come enough and the BTC and Web3 and so on have grown enough that I don't think they're going to be able to do it. So that's my model for your second question, which is why they couldn't do it. They want to, but they lack the competency to do it. All the builders are out.
Which is encouraging, right? I mean, and I think, going back to that Pete Buttigieg example, I found that also a vivid window into a lot of what's going on, because in general, the idea that the person who's nominally in charge of the supply chain would take 4 months off to go take care of a baby to which he didn't give birth in the middle of a supply chain crisis would be something that would just be inherently objectionable, given the hundreds of millions of people adversely affected by that crisis. He's decided,
including their babies,
to take a vacation,
medications, all kinds of things were delayed.
No, I mean every conceivable part of life is adversely affected by that, and yet the one ideology to which American elites do maintain allegiance is woke ideology, which holds that, for example, questioning whether Pete Buttigieg, someone who's not a woman who gave birth to an infant, who therefore needs to care for the infant physiologically, but as an adoptive father should be treated on equal terms and given 4 months of a paternity leave to go take care of an infant that doesn't actually rely upon him physically, when he has this incredibly important position he's assumed because of his social media stardom, is something that can't even be questioned, because it's the fulfillment of the only actual ideology that remains vibrant among these elites, which is this, diversity, inclusion, equity, woke ideology, which is in obvious conflict with a lot of the core competence that they used to display in maintaining this iron grip on the imperialist and corporatist order. And on some level, it's part of why I'm glad that they've decided to pursue those ends as opposed to the ones they used to pursue. They believe they're still adherents to each, but because there's such an internal conflict between the two, because the woke ideology weakens and erodes the ability to maintain the previous prevailing order, on some level, it's to be applauded, as kind of nauseating as it is in many of its expressions. And I think, but I think that that's really the goal. I don't think their goal, as kind of Western elites, is to impose a Chinese style system of repression that can't be resisted.
I think it's more
propagandistic. Yeah, but I think but I think it's propaganda as opposed to brute force. That is their instrument of choice.
Absolutely.
And that can be, Chomsky has talked a lot about this using Orwell. Orwell wrote about this a lot as well, that, co-opting mind is a more powerful way of control and censorship and repression than using iron bars and cages, because it doesn't provoke as much resistance because people aren't aware they're being controlled. It's like what Rosa Luxemburg said, that he who does not move does not notice his chains, right? So if you convince people that their captivity is freedom, they'll fight back against it a lot less than if they know they're being brute repressed. And, that propaganda is still very strong. And I think, what we're really seeing, and this is part of that centralized control, and this is what worries me more than, I don't think they're going to stomp out every attempt to create a Rumble or a Parler or have a Joe Rogan here, or, some dissident there. I think the idea more so is to create as closed of a system as possible, where propaganda persuades people that they're free as opposed to obedient, by redefining all of these words like disinformation and hate speech and misinformation to mean anything that deviates from neoliberal hegemony or woke ideology. And therefore, people believe it's necessary, not just justified, but necessary to censor it, to repress it, to put people in prison who are adherents to it, because it's not just a different way of looking at the world, but something criminalized. And I agree with you. There was less formal legalistic repression after January 6th than there could have been. But the mindset of watching, all of the people who participated in that January 6th protest that turned into a riot, being sent to prison for 3 and 4 and 5 years after being held in solitary confinement for over a year, even ones who didn't use any violence at all, and watching pretty much the entire establishment applaud it, is the kind of chilling effect that propaganda can have, by just constantly calling it an insurrection, which implies that